Around the turn of the century, we began to experiment with the idea of a horseless carriage. During its early years, the automobile had a rather difficult time. For the most part, it was rejected as an impractical device, and several of the early pioneers suffered humiliation and bankruptcy for their courage or their vision. Gradually, however, this form of transportation not only created a place for itself, but changed the entire history of human society. And most of the complexity in our modern way of life has developed from discoveries in the field of transportation and communication. No change can be made in the basic pattern of our way of life without affecting us not only physically, but morally, culturally, and spiritually. In the 20s of the present century, we began our investigation of atomics. That is, we began to take them rather seriously. At that time, it was the general opinion of scientific men that the experimentation was far too dangerous. As one expressed it around 1924, we realize that this field is opening, and we sincerely hope that our researches will fail. The reason why this attitude was taken was because these earlier researchers, with their roots deeper in 19th century mysticism and religious orthodoxy, were appalled at the possibility of loosing upon society the tremendous responsibility of the atomic age. After these men came a Great Depression and an incredible world war. And in the course of this war, the military requirements of a nation required or demanded research and the gradual integration of the atomic theory. So out of the military aspect came the pressure which induced science to go forward into this field of exploration. Today we are faced with the consequences, and to assume for a moment that these changes will be limited to any field is to be very short-sighted. Discoveries such as we are making today will move humanity into an entirely new pattern of existence. We are therefore privileged, even though this privilege bears a great many burdens with it, to live in one of those tremendous eras in which the entire policy of human life is in a process of rapid change. There is no use today to contemplate the possibility of forgetting or ignoring or of dropping back into old ways. These ways are gone, and we must face a future in which these scientific discoveries become an integral part of the way of life of the private citizen. Realizing this inevitable, we must brace ourselves for the impact of an almost constant sequence of new ideas and new applications of existing ideas. Things which we believed impossible 50 years ago, we must reevaluate. Things that seemed to be beyond the horizon now loom large. And much of the burden that we sort of hoped would fall upon unborn futurity has landed in our own lap. In this time also, we are in a heavy state of internal demoralization. In these days, our securities, these securities being in the form of our traditional patterns, are being rapidly violated, destroyed. And the average person finds it difficult to retain a proper balanced attitude. He finds it hard to keep pace with the time without developing excessive nervous tensions. The only answer for the private citizen under these conditions is to relax to the future. Learn to accept the unbelievable as the inevitable. Learn to face these changes without unnecessary anxiety, recognizing that the great history of our world is that these changes gradually work together, form patterns, and become the conventional foundations for still future change. We may worry, we may be anxious, and we have cause. But if we continue to take a negative attitude towards the circumstances around us which are inevitable, we shall only damage our own psychic life. If this be the case, and it is the case, we must also view with some thoughtfulness the newest phase of our great program of scientific progress in space. And that is man reaching out from the planet on which he lives to other members of the great universal family, of which his small planet is an insignificant part. This reaching out toward space has perhaps psychological implications which we should consider. From very early time, the human being has inwardly visualized a relationship with the universe, which up to now he has never been able to make rational or possible. The idea of being totally isolated on a small planet, moving through space, has always been a great frustration upon the human psychic life. The individual, from a point of isolation, is always reaching out toward communion, toward contact, toward understanding, and toward those around him as means of his own escape. Today we see this great psychic pressure in man leading him forward toward contact with other parts of his solar system. Actually, these pressures are producing at this time only a physical adventure. They are causing man to hope or desire or feel that it is necessary for him to begin the active exploration of space. This exploration symbolism, however, deals with his own internal. And as we go back for at least 4,000 or 5,000 years, we observe that certain symbolism has arisen within man relating to this future exploration. The question we must all ask, of course, is this symbolism valid? And as we explore further, we realize that man has a powerful intuitive faculty, a faculty which is capable of rationalization without the advantages of so-called modern instrumentation. If, therefore, we remember that nearly 2,500 years ago, Socrates, by intuitive procedure within himself, came to a very accurate description of the earth as a planet at a time when such description seemed utterly fantastic. We know that man can dream true or intuit correctly within himself, although it may be hundreds or thousands of years before his intuition will become factually demonstrable. Socrates described the earth as a ball floating in space, the surface of it divided into seas and continents. Now this is a long time ago, and 2,000 years after Socrates, Columbus had great difficulty in trying to convince anyone of the spherical form of our planet. Yet Socrates, by means of some faculty, some instrument of his own internal nature, was able to sense these facts. And Eratosthenes, another Greek of intuitive nature, by the same means measured the diameter of the earth, arriving at within 25 miles of our present calculation, without instruments, without observatories, without the advanced forms of knowledge that we possess. These individuals sensed the fact. If, therefore, they possess this power of sensing from within their own psychic life, we are forced to assume that within man there is a sensing power which is capable of anticipating facts, capable of sensing with a strong internal visualization things that later will come under our scientific dominion. This power to sense has created a tradition, and this tradition in turn has undoubtedly directed scientific effort. It has given man a strange, subtle courage, a conviction that things can be done, or that a certain problem can be solved. And out of this conviction, he has gradually gathered the instruments for its fulfillment. Thus, at this time, with our minds on moon travel, it might be interesting to go back and see what the intuitive consciousness of man has thought about this, or has discovered within itself about this kind of an adventure. Also, to consider, if possible, phases of this situation which may be long in maturing on a scientific level. Because the intuitive life of man has never been materialistic. The intuitive life has dared to visualize invisible values. It has surrounded tangible things with auras of overtones, and its speculations have gone far beyond any modern equipment by which these speculations could be immediately demonstrated. Yet how do we know that in time these very speculations will not again press man on to instruments of proof and discovery? One point that might be worth weighing for the moment is the probable degree of accuracy of this intuiting power in man. We can say, yes, a few extraordinary examples have been remembered because they were correct. Were these accidental? Have we buried innumerable intuitive convictions that failed, or that were not demonstrated by fact, or did not survive the growth of human experience? I would say yes, there is no doubt that we have buried countless theories that were not proven to be true, as we have stored away in our patent office in numerous contrivances, models, and specifications that could never operate and could never mean anything if they did. Therefore, our intuiting power is not always infallible. It would seem, consequently, that its integrity depends upon levels. Persons of certain level have the power to dream true. Others without the same internal integration are not so successful. Yet it may also be that nearly everyone will at some time have a hunch that will prove true, or will intuit something, but perhaps not with consistent regularity. Therefore, experience has shown that the type of intuition which has contributed strongly to progress has been held by a certain kind of person, a person of extraordinary achievements on the level of rationality, such as Socrates, or a person of extraordinary attainments on the level of internal spiritual integration, such as Buddha or Confucius. These types of persons, from a broader internal life within themselves, have censored their own intuitions. They have made it unlikely that a ridiculous notion would find acceptance even in themselves, and a certain amount of daydreaming has been filtered out, leaving only certain hard cores of experience, and these in turn supported by a broad contemplation of known facts. Thus, intuition is to a measure dependent upon our understanding of that which is already known, and the extension of this by drawing upon internal resources of judgment, stimulated and directed by imagination. A good example of this type of thing, more recent but still focused to our thinking, is the work of Jules Verne's, whose extraordinary novels were regarded as pure fantasy 100 years ago, and yet today are comparatively acceptable and known to all of us as great imagination, but based upon a true pre-knowledge or pre-sensing of things that were to come. Our immediate goal at the moment, and of course we may regard this as a sign of modesty, is that we are going to attack the moon. If we were more optimistic, we might sail right by it to some more distant point. But it is the nearest, and by convenience seems to offer the most immediate possibility. We understand that various individuals are forming groups and making arrangements for early transportation. One advertisement not long ago suggested that it would take reservations for 1970 for lunar trips, but that in the meantime we should try their Bermuda cruise, which is presently available. The moon has always fascinated mankind and has seemed to exercise an extraordinary influence over this very psychic, intuiting part of our natures. We have associated it with imagination. We have recognized from very ancient periods that the presence of the moon and its relation to the earth, these have affected the earth strongly, and that certain phenomena with which we are constantly familiar and which have become part of our daily living, these phenomena are due to the influence of the moon. Ancient man recognized its effect upon the tides. He realized also that it moved or affected growth upon the earth, and the farmer has long regarded the influence of the moon in the planting and cultivating of his land. The moon also has shown a strong affinity to the human cycle of generation. It has emphasized sterility and fertility. It has created cycles within man, cycles of attitudes. It has resulted in strange distortions of his emotional imagination, resulting in its association with madness, which was long known as lunacy or moon sickness. Old cultures and traditions and folklore have therefore many interesting reports or ideas about the moon. Also, in a comparatively early time, serious thought was given to it by scholars, by scientists, by priests, in an effort to understand the meaning of it. In the ancient Babylonian and Assyrian period, the moon was called or named Sin, S-I-N. This word had no sense of evil as we know it. It was simply the name of a deity, the moon god. However, as time went on, this moon deity came to be associated with the delinquencies of man. And the sinner is one who was under the influence of the moon god. It meant that a kind of madness had developed. And among our early writings, we find some interesting moral advice about this. One old priest tells us that it is obvious that sin is madness, for the reason that any individual who does wrong must be insane or he will not do it. Now, that's a rather broad statement. In other words, the thief, the liar, the avaricious person, the criminal, and even the individual who commits small faults must do these things under the spell of madness. For any person in his right mind must know that he cannot succeed in the doing of evil. Therefore, unless he is sick, he will not do wrong. This perhaps is not just the way we look at it, but it's an interesting point that perhaps is worth a little consideration. The moon god, in this time among these people, had a very important part to play, because he was also associated with imagination or visualization. And it was greatly held by the ancients that inspiration or spiritual revelation had to do with the moon. The moon, of course, ruled the night, and the night was the time of visions, of dreams, and of those strange experiences of sleep with which human beings were long aware, and which they for centuries were unable to equate rationally. Thus, when the moon came, men left this world. They departed into a kind of unconsciousness which could be troubled by dreams and phantoms. This was the time also when in their visions and in their imaginations the dead came to them, where the spirits lived while men slept. And it was anciently believed that at night the spirits left their graves and came forth to their strange dance macabre. Thus a world of unseens, a world which was merely the extroversion of man's psychic part, came in the night. For in the darkness of the ancient world, with no interest to keep the individual burning his midnight oil, which he had not yet discovered, man was awake in light and slept in darkness. If for any reason he did not sleep, he was alone in a great mystery. The cries of the jungle around him, the shadows which he could no longer be sure he could identify, the wild, the strange, the unknown encroached upon him. And most of all, darkness was a mirror which reflected his own fears, and out of himself trooped all the locked-up agencies and factors and values which his daily consciousness held in check. Thus man, in the daytime, was objective. He controlled his life. But at night, his own subjective controlled him, and he had no orienting factors with which to compensate. So in these long periods of darkness, he was more or less released, and his internal fears or values or his hopes, his disasters, his problems, his worries, his griefs, and he had them all. These gained ascendancy in night and were pushed back again by the coming of day, when another series of objective responsibilities came into existence. Night was therefore the era of the supernatural. Day was the problem of the natural. And natural and supernatural succeeded each other in an endless sequence throughout life. This sequence had a way of balancing the individual. Of course, it presented him with tremendous problems, but it maintained a certain ratio between his internal and external life. And while this ratio continued, it is very unlikely that he would suffer from nervous breakdowns and things of that nature. He had certain psychic release. Now, in this psychic release, all kinds of strange appearances came to him. All types of internal musings were stirred within himself. And he finally came to the conclusion that over this entire world of fantasy governed the shimmering disk of the great lunar deity. Now also, ancient man found that in night, as against day, there was a curious phenomenon with which he was not so able to cope. In the daytime, the sun rose, moved across the sky, and set apparently in the west. Therefore, the daily appearance of the sun was regular, but the nocturnal appearance of the moon was not regular, because the moon increased in light for approximately 14 days, and then decreased in light, so that there were some nights in which the moon was seen only as a crescent, and other nights in which it was not seen at all. Thus there was a cyclic motion of the moon. Ancient man responded to this cyclic motion, and he seemed to experience unusual difficulties within his own nature at the new moon and at the full moon. Even today, exploration and research sustains something to indicate there is a psychic flow and ebb pattern in man. I read some statistics not long ago about accidents in the San Francisco Bay Bridges. And the report was that for reasons unknown, these accidents had maximum periods approximately at the new and full moon. Why, no one seemed to know. Mental institutions have similar records, that the new moon particularly is most exciting and irritating to patients. Also, certain types of heart trouble definitely have a lunar cycle. And there are numerous such cycles obvious in human life. Ancient man believed, therefore, that his psychic life cycle, moving upon the lunar cycle, had certain critical periods. And these critical periods were especially intensified by eclipses of the moon. And it is recorded, for example, that Lord Bacon always fainted when there was an eclipse of the moon, whether he knew about the eclipse or not. The effect of the moon, therefore, gathered a great deal of lore and was held with unusual respect by ancient mystics and priests. Lunar ceremonies were also quite common, and the lunar deity comes strongly into focus among ancient peoples, perhaps more so than we realize. That the moon was associated with inspiration, revelation, we know, because in those times men's visits into the supernatural were usually at night. It's also curious, but perhaps important to remember, that Moses received the revelations of the law on Mount Sinai. This means, in the ancient language, the mountain of the moon. This was a lunar mountain, set aside anciently to the worship of a lunar cult. The lunar cult and the solar cult very often had completely separate spiritual institutions in antiquity. And the lunar cult had nearly always to do with the more subtle, mystical problems of life. The solar cult had to do with objective strength, the lunar with subjective power and force. Among many peoples, the lunar deity was feminine, but this was not consistently true in all cases. It was feminine because it was observed that the feminine nature responds more accurately and immediately to lunar cycles, whereas man seems to react positively to solar cycles. The Mayas and people of Central America developed both a solar and a lunar calendar and methods of calculating and perpetuating knowledge, because they believed that there were two distinct streams of knowledge, one lunar and the other solar, and that these, by their union, by a kind of philosophical generation, produced a higher form of knowledge. Albertus Magnus and Aquinas, the two great medieval theologians of the church, believed that the moon controlled the humors or liquids and gases in the human body, and that there were tides in the brain which agreed with the tides of the earth, and that the liquids in the brain particularly were drawn by the lunar cycle, resulting in the fact that certain types of mental energy were available at one time and other types at another time. All of this speculation goes further and further back until we get to those old Brahmins of India who were among the first great daydreamers of space. India has long held for thousands of years the possibility of communication between planets. Long before we assumed that other planets existed, they had already charted this probability. And they were already aware at a comparatively early date, especially Buddhism, that not only were there other planets, but that these planets were inhabited, and that these inhabitants were in various ways different because of the kind of world on which they developed. It was therefore assumed in antiquity that creations were influenced by their environments, taking forms most natural and suitable to the climates and relations of natural phenomena around them. That other planets were populated, there seemed to be no doubt. Now, the Hindu position was this, namely that our planet was a comparatively inferior one. They apparently didn't have quite the ego of our modern thinker. They were a more modest group. And they did not hold that we represented a top-notch place in space. They were inclined to have the same attitude that was later expressed by Mark Twain in his story of Captain Stormfield's journey to heaven. Captain Stormfield found it a little difficult to find the Earth on the great chart up in the sky, which was prepared to identify visitors from various worlds. It was finally decided that they found the Earth, but they were not sure whether it was the Earth or a fly speck. But in any event, there was a modest attitude on the part of the Asiatic. He believed, as long as 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, that communication between the Earth and other planets had already existed, and had existed for a very long time. In fact, the Hindu takes the attitude that there could not be life upon this planet had there not been communication with other worlds, assuming that life is a kind of perpetuation from an appropriate form of seed or from some other natural means. When the Earth emerged from the ordeal of the fire nebula, when it gradually came into manifestation, it was first of all completely sterilized by the tremendous volcanic activity within itself. Therefore it was truly without creature upon it, or without any possibility of life having survived within this molten mass, that is, life such as we know. Consequently, the only way that life could be on this planet is that it was brought here, that it came here in some manner. The Hindu was of the opinion that it came from the moon, and that actually, therefore, as far as life and growth are concerned, the moon is the mother of the earth. Now this may cause some consternation and be considered relatively an unscientific statement. But let us see exactly what was meant by this. Suppose we assume for a moment what we probably will have to assume ultimately, namely that the moon, though apparently a dead body, is not actually dead. It may be dead as far as any correspondence or similarity to what we call life. Even, however, if we wish to assume it to be what we have not yet proved it to be, and that is a so-called dead world, we know that it reflects the light of the sun, and in turn that this reflected light strikes the earth. Now this reflected light striking the earth from the moon produces a different reaction from the direct light of the sun upon the earth. As a result of that, there are certain magnetic changes in the energies by means of which the night of the world is lighted. Consequently, the mirror of the moon, if we want to call it that, has some power to transform energy, to change it, and to reflect this energy in a different manner from the direct light of the sun, although the direct light is identical in its substance with that which is reflected toward the earth from the moon. Thus, if we may say, as in a case of a spectrum, that we find a light broken up, so something happens to solar light energy when it is bounced to us from the surface of the moon. That such a change occurs, I do not believe can be questioned. The reason for this change may be of greater difficulty. One thing that has been advanced is that quality is affected by angle of refraction or of reflection. Thus, the fact that the light of the sun strikes the moon and then at an angle strikes the earth may be said to be one reason why its vibratory rate is modified. We also, however, may assume that there is something about the surface of the moon by means of which the light rays pick up a new light factor. For example, the Japanese, in some of their Shinto rituals, make use of metal mirrors. And if you trace upon a surface of metal mirror or any other kind a design of some kind, such as in the Japanese case an inscription or a symbol, then you reflect light from the surface of this mirror onto a wall or other object. The symbol is also reflected. Thus we have the pattern that a shape or design interfering with the evenness of the mirror's reflection causes a change in the image that is reflected. This may be perfectly understandable physically, But we are not sure that our problem ends physically. We are not sure that this reflection is not also in the field of energy, and that there is an energy reflection which includes a kind of abstract formal image, a qualitative image of some kind of energy conditioned, an energy that is not exactly like the energy that comes directly from the sun. And also because this reflection is not consistent, but increases and decreases cyclically, we are told by the ancients at least that this cyclic motion has a tremendous part to play in the internal life of things, and that this internal life depends upon the light of the moon as our external life depends upon the light of the sun. All of this is, we will say, in the sphere of speculation, but again, it belongs to a long range of highly intuitive reflections or thoughts. Also in the Indian philosophy, we have the possibility that they have expressed for a long time, that life can move or can be conveyed by rays of energy. In other words, wherever a ray of light strikes, that ray of light is itself a conveyor of things. To the East Indian, a ray of light is a conveyor of intelligence. It is a conveyor of deity. It may also form a bridge upon which beings of some kind can move. Thus, as the Bifrost Bridge of Nordic Scandinavia, the Bridge of Rainbow, supported all the gods but great Thor, who shook it to its foundation, so in the ancient Indian philosophy it was believed that light forms a medium of transportation and communication, that it is perfectly possible for intelligent entities to move upon light, that it is perfectly possible for beings to move from planet to planet upon light rays, and that it is also possible for the intelligent beings upon the sun to control and direct any planet by means of light. This is something which is still in the range of science fiction as far as we are concerned, but we have not proved that it is untrue, nor have we been able to demonstrate that we cannot sometime ourselves travel upon light. It is quite conceivable that the gradual development of space travel will reveal to us that ultimately wherever a light ray goes, we can go. And that this forms the final and most abstract type of motivation power. And that anything that we need in forms of propulsion or transportation is to be sustained by light alone. Therefore, that wherever a light ray follows, it is quite conceivable that a wave of life may move in the light. For this light is a kind of energy field which is in itself invisible and is only visible to us when it comes into certain atmospheric relationships. But actually, light is life. It is energy. And the Hindu tells us that all the planets of a solar system are held together by a chemistry of light patterns. That from the sun, light is continually streaming, and that this light, received by all the planets in a solar system, and also by their luminaries, that these planets in their reflecting power also cast rays upon each other, that they are all tied together by reflected light and are bound to the sun by direct light. Consequently, all planets are at all times in communication in some way. And the difficulty that man has experienced has been his acceptance of physical interval with no consideration for the binders by which all things in space are held in certain patterns of relationship. If it is conceivable, as the Hindu of old told us, therefore, that all these light polarities constitute a common form of communication, that energy from the sun is acceptable to all the planets, that they have polarities in which they are able to absorb and adapt this sun, this light energy. They receive it, even though it comes through a vast area of space. They also reflect parts of it. Having taken certain things out of this light, they reflect the rest, and in turn form, therefore, a group of secondary conditioned light fields. These, in turn, mingle with the luminary fields. And luminary fields, to the ancient Hindus, indicated a degree of development upon planets in which certain residue was being cast off, and also that the presence of moons indicated powerful psychic life within the beings of those planets. The absence of moons indicating either that this psychic life had been outgrown or had not yet developed. This interesting pattern caused the ancient Oriental to say that from the earliest times, this light, in its spiritual and essential nature, reached the earth bearing within it the extensions of consciousness, of beings. Therefore, the rishis, or the great sages of ancient India, were some of them said to be star-born, and others to have been moon-born. The Lunar Pitras, the ancestors, are said to have been beings who came from the moon, descending upon rays of light, descending within the qualitative fields of these energies. It was also assumed, however, that these beings were not normal or natural citizens of the earth. Therefore, they affected it but never mingled with it, never became identical with it. The Indians also believe that communication between other planets by waves of energy and this planet resulted in the arrival here of certain forms of life, otherwise not to be found here. Among the forms of life which they said came from other planets are bees, which do not belong here. Also bananas and wheat. These great life-giving things are said to have been brought along rays of energy from other planets at remote times in the development of our solar system. Thus, to the Hindu, the idea of communication between planets or between the earth and the luminary presented no great trouble. The Oriental eyebrow would scarcely have risen at all. First of all, however, he would like to ask a question, perhaps, and that is, what kind of communication do you mean? Do you mean communication in form of invasion, or communication in form of sharing? Do you mean that you want to conquer the moon, or that you want to understand the moon? To conquer another planet means only to reach it, and if it be inhabited, to reach it with a superior power, physically. To understand it means a growth within yourself. And the Hindu held that the rays of all the forms of life in nature converge in the consciousness of man, and that therefore man can solve the riddle of any problem merely by the acceptance of the energy of that problem and the gradual interpretation of that energy correctly through functions of consciousness. To the Oriental, therefore, the moon can be understood by the actual sharing of its field of energy and interpreting this energy intelligently. The Hindu would not feel that it would be impossible for consciousness to project itself on light and reach the moon. And I talked some time ago to a scholar who had done a great deal of work with Indian philosophy. He rather smilingly said that according to the old concept, we are wasting an awful lot of time doing an awful lot of hard work that is totally unnecessary, simply because we are trying to hurl a physical projectile to another planet, when actually we already have within ourselves the capacity to fully know that planet and to move quietly and peacefully onto it if we want to. That the answer always lies within man himself. That this possibility of projecting consciousness along the reverse motion of energy fields simply means that man must turn from the conquest of environment to the unfoldment of self. And that if he so conducts his researches, everything almost which he now achieves mechanically, he can achieve intuitively. He can transform his intuition into a great field of research and can find absolute scientific methods of exploring the most remote areas simply by the projection of his own consciousness. He has not yet learned this, however, and may not for a while, but he is moving toward it, because one of the ways in which consciousness becomes projected is through familiarity. And man, having found ways of physically overcoming interval, will ultimately find that this will develop intuitive and superphysical ways of bridging interval. Man, locked by his body, must carry it with him wherever he goes, hence the need for solid conveyance. But man, having achieved internal liberation from body without death, and the possibility of projecting consciousness apart from body, can accomplish many things now conceived to be impossible. And yet this concept is no more remarkable than that with which we are now working scientifically. And our scientific research in its exploration of energy must finally return to the contemplation of conscious energy as we have it in man. The moment we have that, we will know that the power in man which allows him to know something can be developed to enable him to know more. We have just been blocked by external effort in this particular direction. Plutarch, in his study, for example, of the other side of the moon, which was an early research into this problem, tells us something else that perhaps will be of interest. The general opinion is now that the other side of the moon is just like this one. Now that's a very trite way of looking at it, and at the moment apparently irrefutable. But is it true? Certainly we do not expect to find on the opposite side of the moon some mystery unsolvable, some strange situation unbelievable. But we have not yet been able to see the other side of the moon. That means that the moon, for the most part, receives its reflected rays from the earth to itself on one surface predominantly. Now nobody, no sphere in space, can receive its energies consistently on one area without that area being different from the area on which the energy does not fall or does not directly center. Therefore, we may assume that the moon is strongly polarized, and that one face of the moon, so-called, is under bombardment from the earth much more than the other, and consequently, in its chemical, magnetic, and electrical fields there will be differences, quite different from those of the earth, which receives a much more generalized power from energy fields. So it would be quite possible to say that the other side of the moon will have vibratory differences. Whether these show in any physical conformation, we do not say, but certainly there will be different reactions under such instruments as Geiger counters and things of that nature, as a result of the reflected rays of the earth being largely restricted to one face of the moon's surface. Another problem that Plutarch brought up, and which I think perhaps is well worth considering again, is the possibility of there being creatures or beings on the moon. Later, of course, Cyrano de Bergerac, in his journey to the moon, solved this question without doubt. He said certainly there are creatures there, and he pointed out that they were comparatively highly evolved, and in a fantasy he visited them, and found among them the daemon instructor of Socrates. Now this is a fable, but it is a pointed one, because the intuitive power of Socrates would very well have been explained under the power of the moon. So perhaps in some strange way his intuition was moon-guided, considered moon madness in his time, but now recognized as a great contribution to human good. In any event, Plutarch points out that we have absolutely no assurance that there are no beings on the moon. Up to very recently, we decided arbitrarily that there was no atmosphere on the moon. Recently, however, this attitude has also been modified. It is now assumed that there is an atmosphere on the moon, but that it is extremely attenuated and would not under any possibility support the kind of life we have here. That this atmosphere is very, very subtle, very thin, perhaps almost similar to our own on the remote edge of the atmospheric field. The moon's atmosphere, then, being different from ours, it is as obvious that it could not sustain life of our kind. Now suppose by some interesting phenomenon we get there, and we probably will. The question is, we will explore, and perhaps we will find no sign of life. Or we may have a discovery somewhat like Robinson Crusoe's discovery of a mysterious footprint for which we can find no person. You know, it would be a very fantastic thing if we got there and found one evidence of life and nothing else. That could ruin us and worry us into a complete scientific decline. The only thing that we are worried about at the moment is that we do not get there to find someone there who speaks Russian. That is if that doesn't happen, all else will be forgiven. But if we get there and we do explore, and perhaps we find no sign of life, so Plutarch brings up the question, is this a proof that there is no life? Or must we assume of the moon as of other worlds that life is a certain ratio of relationship between matter and consciousness? Would it therefore be quite possible that the moon could be populated with beings completely outside of our dimensions? That was Plutarch's early thinking on the subject. And we have no way of estimating the correctness of it, unless we find some evidence or some trace. Now, supposing we did find some symbol of some ancient possibility of inhabitants on the moon, and no sign that inhabitants continued, what would we then be faced with? According to the Greeks, we would be faced by one factor only, namely that the changing polarization of the moon had forced this life gradually into the atmosphere around the planet. That the moon itself physically would not sustain life, but life will not die. Therefore, life moves out into space and takes up a relationship in that zone where the negative power of the moon and the positive power of the sun form an equilibrium, or create a neutral area in which life can develop. In the case of the moon, it may not be on the surface, it may not be under the surface, it may be in the atmospheric field surrounding the planet. How to study this will probably be a great question, and we do not pretend at the moment to know what the findings will be. But one thing that we cannot be sure is that any body in space, so-called living or dead, is without inhabitants, without creatures of some kind subsisting in it or on it, or in its atmosphere. Socrates was of the opinion, for instance, that there were waves of life upon this planet, which, as the various geological phases of planetary development changed the surface, that these were forced out, and that therefore there are zones of living things in our atmosphere that we cannot see because they have retired from the tangible forms that we know. But according to their own needs, they live in a neutral field created by the meeting of the earth and solar energies at a certain distance from the earth's surface. And that within these fields they have specialized their own existences with their own sensory fields of cognition, and that as far as they are concerned, their life is just as real as ours. But we cannot see it. So in our journey out into space, we must not only be prepared for the physical factors of other habitable worlds, but we must be prepared for the mutations in physical structure which various fields of energy create. And therefore, we must develop some means of extending the area of our sensory perception. Now, we will probably do this in the beginning by means of devices of one kind or another, which we hope will be sensitive enough to pick up vibratory rates beyond our sense perceptions. Ultimately, however, we will probably find out, as India found out in its yogic disciplines, that the only answer is to gain a flexible power to change your own rate of vibration in certain sensory fields by will, and therefore be capable of tuning in and tuning out various levels of consciousness now at this time unknown to us or beyond our reasonable perception. Now, as far as the moon is concerned, it is apt to form a great psychic experience because of its own nature. And perhaps it will become one of the tremendous factors in reintegrating the psychic life of man. It is going to challenge this phase of his nature, and perhaps will result in the opening of new psychic faculties for the further contemplation of space. Assuming, however, that the moon is not populated with cognizable creatures, creatures like ourselves, or nearly so, or caricatures of our own likenesses, then we will undoubtedly also press on further into space. Perhaps not as rapidly, but with the same inevitability. Suppose we come in contact somewhere out there with a populous world sufficiently like our own so that we can know of its existence, even though we may not be able to understand it. Suppose for the first time humanity comes face to face with another kind of creature. A creature completely different from himself, and yet perhaps a creature equally rational or more so. This is likely to prove one of the most incredible shocks to our psychic integration that can possibly happen. It will almost certainly totally change us. It will not be the mere fact that we will go into business with a new interplanetary neighbor, or we'll have short weekend trips, or perhaps in this case short century-end trips, because some of the distances are going to be rather massive. It is going to do something that we've never been able to do before, and that is hear a definition of ourselves from a different kind of creature. A lot of people would give a great deal. I talked to a physicist not long ago. He said, I would give a great deal if my dog could talk and tell me what he thinks of me and the world in which he lives. He says, I see expressions on his face occasionally that give me serious misgivings, but he cannot put them into words. Suppose we came face to face with a totally different way of life, yet a way of life equally or more fruitful than our own. Suppose we came to a planet with a great culture which had devised its culture and perfected it without recourse to any process that we know, did not build it in the same way, did not move from any of the incentives that we move from, was completely unaware of education as we know it, and yet was wiser than we are, evolving and moving from a totally different perspective. Suppose we came upon a planet inhabited by a very advanced culture which in its entire history had never known war. What would we do about it? I mean, what would we think about it? What would it do to our way of life? Supposing also we came into a culture in which every value that we regard as important has been discarded as barbarian, and every value which we deny or think of no importance has been highly cultivated. Of course, the end would be what has happened to these other people. We would have to equate their way of life. Certainly, we would not accept the stimulating suggestions of a group of beings that had not developed beyond the Stone Age itself. But we have no way of knowing, and we seriously suspect that due to the relationship of the solar and electric and magnetic fields, that some of the planets at least are almost certainly more advanced than we are if they maintain life at all. And we are certain in our own natures, from the ancient pressure of our psychic force, that they do maintain life. If such is the case, and we come upon a totally different way of life, this may be a total indictment of our own. An indictment not of what we've done in the last 50 years or the last 500 years, but an indictment of our entire way of life since its beginning. Such an indictment is possible for one reason. As we look back upon history, in our way of life, we always move before we know. All motion arises from the pressure of ignorance, not from the pressure of knowledge. We therefore made plans before we knew how to make plans, and then had to try to make them work or operate. Civilization was pointed in the direction in which it is now moving at a prehistoric time when no one knew how to point rationally in any direction. Our only hope was that our intuitive nature was truer than our intellectual ignorance. But something evidently did not work out, because we have produced a way of life that has been in misery since its beginning, and becomes more and more confused with every century that passes. Suppose we find another world in which such confusion does not exist, simply because a different basic attitude sustained by a different psychochemical field of operation simply never knew the problems that we know, never had the limitations that we have. And we suddenly discover that we are living in a kind of polyglot universe, a universe composed of a family of worlds, each with its own orders of life, and that these orders of life, in their varying degrees of development, present the new international, interplanetary world problem. That instead of dealing with 4 or 5 major racial groups on this planet and trying to form some kind of a pattern of integration by which they can survive, we suddenly find ourselves not any longer satisfied with a League of Nations, but now we need a League of Planets. That instead of United Nations, we need United Planets. And that these planets, each of them, have developed cultures. We do not know, for example, whether any of these other planets are in communication with each other. In all the excitement, we seem to rather overlook this possibility. We do not know whether we are pioneering or whether we are simply the last small remnant of an empire to be drawn together by somebody else. All these problems sit with some concern upon us, because we are opening a door or opening a Pandora's box, and one of these days it will open to the degree that the contents will come out and we can never get it back in again. We must be faced with the continuance of this procedure. Now let us take for a moment one point where we could have a very interesting situation arise. And the old folks of the ancient world have already anticipated thus too. What might this do to religion? Here is a question. What kind of religion has been developed on other planets? What is the attitude, the basic attitude of other worlds to this thing which we call sacredness? Do they believe in God? Do they know far more about it than we do? Do they know less? Are we entering into a vast materialistic world, or are we entering into a sphere in which perhaps we are the last benighted member? In other words, will our theologies fit an interplanetary family life? Are we going to wake up and find that all space sustains our faith? Or are we going to wake up and find that this faith is totally within our own environment? If so, are we going to move forward into a greater faith, or are the things we discover going to be inclined to tear down the faith we have? It would be my opinion, and it was certainly that of the Hindus, and also of the Egyptians who speculated on these things, that these other worlds, we intuitively sense, have faith. They have a recognition of something superior to themselves. But if they are greater than we are, they are less superstitious. And of course, this will cause quite an impact. And it is quite a question as to how many missionaries we will start sending to them. And there's always the bare possibility they'll send a few to us. And this could be a most confusing situation. Supposing we'd suddenly discovered that on these other worlds, society had reached a degree of integrity, integration, and unification, built upon some spiritual conviction totally unfamiliar to us, but at the same time, a conviction that has produced irrefutable evidence of its superiority. What are we going to do? Are we going to be able to stretch our faith to meet theirs? Is it going to be a head-on impact? In other words, is interplanetary travel going to change our attitude toward deity, toward creation, toward universal procedure, cause and effect, all of these great ethical, spiritual foundations of our culture? It would seem almost certain that they will be changed. But it is not certain that they can be destroyed. Because if the basic spiritual instinct in man arises from a universal fact, then that instinct is going to be present in other peoples or other kinds of creatures. But this instinct will undoubtedly develop in a different manner because of different problems. A people that has never known war may never know hate, and therefore may not have the problems that we have. What are the problems of people different from ourselves? Are there worlds of problems we know nothing about? Or are we going to find that this planetary family, because it is dependent upon one sun for its light and life, is essentially very much alike? The Greeks were of the opinion that psychically all of the beings in a planetary system have certain similarity. Therefore, that actually, internally, we are apt to be more alike than we are externally. And it is very possible that what we shall find is the same kind of individuation which we find in connection with people. No two persons are alike, though operating with a very similar psychic content. Therefore, it is possible that the beings on these planets, physically modified by the various environments upon which they exist, and psychically modified by these environments and by the pressures of the problems which they have faced, may still have a very similar psychic core, and therefore will be capable of psychic exchange with man, whether we know their language or whether they speak a language or not. So we go back to the ancient Oriental background again, and the fantasies of the Arabian Nights and the fantasies of the Indian stories and legends, and the old myths and beliefs which we find still in Tibet and in other remote areas. And we've come to the possibility that there are these beings in space, that perhaps they no longer speak. Perhaps they only communicate by impressing thought. Perhaps they are not limited to place. They may not have houses as we know them, because they live in the greater mansion of their own consciousness. Perhaps they no longer eat food as we know it, perform the natural functions that we perform. Yet they are beings growing up within a great solar family. And therefore they open to us perhaps the thing that we do not have today. In fact, India, I think, believed they would. Namely, they would open to us for the first time a perspective of direction. They would show us, by their relative developments in relation to ourselves, how the solar pattern unfolds, something we have never really been able to integrate. Also, that if they are using faculties which we do not possess, they will give us a clear demonstration of those faculties at a time when perhaps we would otherwise be unbelieving. The Indians believed that on some of these planets we had beings that we would consider to be gods, and yet in their own world they are not gods. They are beings possessing faculties and powers in full function, which we know only as myths and legends. If such is the case, the demonstration of these faculties and powers is in turn likely to completely change the motion of civilization. If human beings ever really believed that the culture of internals is more important than the defense of externals, and came to united effort on that, we would undoubtedly begin to grow as beings rather than merely extend ourselves as cultures. If we can find, therefore, in our space journey evidences in support of this, it is apt to change our entire way of life. I presume that if we ever meet face to face as a people, a culture on another planet, and find that culture to possess values of any kind which we do not possess, or to have attained solutions to any problems that we have not solved, that this immediate contact could be the most world-shaking event in history. For it would mean undoubtedly the gradual but inevitable change of every institution we possess, and might, if it is of the more fortunate kind, impel us to the greatest progress we have ever known. We will then have to compete with space instead of our neighbor. We will have to unfold virtues beyond those that we merely pattern upon the conduct of our friends. This contact, this concept of a total life, may also open to us fields of science unfolded in other worlds, developments of all kinds, giving us a heritage very quickly, almost beyond our comprehension. It may also face us with great problems, with evidences of the audacity of our own efforts, where we may wake some sleeping monster. We may find ourselves in contact with ways of life that are not desirable, and which we must learn to control in some way in order to preserve our own existence. It is a dangerous game that we are playing. But our hope lies perhaps in the ancient conviction that it cannot be a fatal game, for the reason that all of this group that we are thinking about is dependent upon one psychic solar life core, the sun. That the basic integration of the solar energy itself sustains all these lives. Therefore, they must have something in common. They must have certain internal values which they share. And because they have one nutrition, their psychic internal must be to a measure compatible. Thus, this whole procedure may throw the weight of relationships, not upon handshaking and treaties, but upon compatibility of psychic internal natures. Our diplomacy will have to be on a level of our soul function. This will be embarrassing to some folks who haven't been specializing in it. But it may again challenge the kind of growth we need. We've all seen what the automobile did at the turn of this century. It made possible great cities. It kept us on the highway, and it has caused more deaths than war. This tremendous conveyance has also become a deadly weapon. But it did completely change our way of life, and yet it was a comparatively minor thing. Motion pictures affected us. Television affected us. The telephone, the radio, all these things have changed the world in which we live. Yet contact with a rational group of beings on another planet will change us more than all of the changes of the last 2,000 years put together. Because for the first time, it will bring us into competitive or cooperative relationship with a group of lives that did not develop under our culture. Therefore, will give us a space relationship we have never previously known or experienced. It may force us to grow forward, and that is the thing it should do. Because from being citizens of planets, we must become citizens of a solar system. And the fact that it is moving in that way seems to cause it to support the grand concept of evolution. It is gradually coming to the point where planetary life is too provincial for us. We are reaching out to a larger world, a larger experience. And at this critical time, this experience may save us from the tremendous locking of resources which threatens to destroy us today by tipping us totally into, we'll say, a materialistic economy. If our science, developing its instruments, finds that these instruments discover a new way of life, not according to our scientific theory, but according to a universal plan operating in space, we may then be able to use this plan to correct our own science and save our hides, which are in a little bit of danger at the moment. So we look with interest upon this. We realize that the ancients contemplated it rather carefully, and that their final opinion was that these planets are inhabited, that some of these beings are greater than others less than ourselves, and that those that are greater than we are have already been here and have come quietly and departed quietly upon the waves of energy and upon the various means which they possess. That they have been in communication with us, and it is through them that the great philosophies and doctrines of the world have, to a measure, been integrated. It is through them that our knowledge of matters beyond our knowing has descended to us as a heritage. That these communications have been through the psychic field of man. That they have gone on since time immemorial. And that therefore, essentially, the revelations of principles which we have are not incompatible with the principles of a solar philosophical religion. Consequently, our great shocks will be on the outside. But if we try to meet these things with understanding, we will find that this exploration of the solar system will not be more dangerous than might reasonably be expected. But that if we find certain decadent worlds, worlds like our own, perhaps with different equipment, which have, however, become strong in decadence and materialism, then we might be faced with a terrible conflict. A conflict of one power or skill against another. But that this conflict has, as one old sage pointed out, one situation about it that is encouraging. Anyone who will fight us knows no more than we do. The fact he will fight puts him on our level. The individual who knows more than we do in a great family will not attempt to dominate, but will attempt to teach. It is the level of knowing. The person who wants to dominate is way down on the level. And if we contact those who wish to destroy, we may well be able to hold our own. If, however, we contact that which is superior to ourselves, we will contact it without hazard, because anything that knows more than we do will know too much to kill. So out in space, we may have friends and enemies. Our friends should be wiser than we are, and our enemies as stupid as we are. So on that basis, we have hope of survival. We are coming into this great era of change. Our thinking is already affected by it. Ultimately, our philosophy, our religion, our education, everything will be affected by it. But all these changes bring with them maturity, bring with them greater understanding. And out of greater understanding comes growth. And growth is worth all the tension, stress, and pain we must spend getting it. For at the end of growth, and at the end of growth alone, is the peace we seek. That's the end of the morning, too, by the way. Many of you are interested in psychological analysis, and a great many individuals have tried to read a few popular books on it and analyze themselves. Now, some of this self-analysis has been helpful, but a great deal of it has been bad. So if you're interested in yourself and want to know a little more about yourself, there are certain facts that you should have before you try to analyze yourself, because you will approach analysis as a prejudiced person, prejudiced either in your own favor or against someone else. And this will endanger the integrity of a self-analysis. There are many other things that will also endanger it. So we want to analyze a little bit next week the constructive and destructive aspects of self-analysis. We hope you will find it interesting. The new issue of our quarterly journal, Horizon, is on the table this morning, and we hope that you will find it interesting. It contains a number of articles which we believe you will like. I'd like to also mention this morning our counseling service of the Society on Psychological Problems, and you will find note of it on our program, and you can secure a pamphlet setting it forth. Also, consider our book table in general. We have a number of publications which we think you will find interesting. And our book, Self-Unfoldment, might give you an idea of how Buddhism and Hinduism approach the problem of creating within the individual the kind of enlightened and positive receptivity to idea, which might go a long way to take the hazards out of daily living. We think you will find it helpful and useful, and we thank you for being with us this morning.